Montana Territory, 1887. A gentle breeze whispered through the tall prairie grass outside the small town of Pine Creek, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of a coming storm. Julia Warren stood on the auction block, her cheeks burning with humiliation as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty square. 5 feet 10 inches tall, strong-backed. Look at the size of her. Might be too big for most men's liking, but she'll work hard. The auctioneer circled her like a vulture. Starting bid for this mail-order bride, $50. Julia's hands trembled at her sides. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a schoolteacher in Boston. Now, she was merchandise, a mail-order bride whose intended had taken one look at her height and declared her unfit for a proper household. He'd promptly turned around and sold his contract to the highest bidder. The crowd of rough-looking men shifted uncomfortably. Some laughed. Others muttered about her being too much woman for any sensible man. $40? The auctioneer's voice faltered. 35. Julia stared at the horizon, refusing to let tears fall. Her burgundy traveling dress, once her pride with its modest bustle and lace collar, now felt like a costume. Her chestnut hair, carefully pinned beneath her small hat, was coming loose in the wind. $25. Surely someone will take her at 25. From the back of the crowd, a young man in a worn leather vest and dusty boots stepped forward. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. His honey-brown hair caught the sunlight, and his face, clean-shaven save for the lightest shadow of stubble, was tanned from days under the open sky. "I'll take her," he called out, his voice steady and clear. The crowd parted as he approached, some men snickering, others watching with curious eyes. "You sure, Ethan?" someone called. "She's a mighty big woman." The young man, Ethan, didn't bother responding. He counted out the bills, handed them to the auctioneer, then turned to Julia. His eyes were kind as they met hers, a rich hazel color that reminded her of autumn in New England. "Miss," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Ethan Keller. I have a ranch 10 miles north of town." Julia hesitated, then placed her gloved hand in his. Julia Warren. What happened next would forever be etched in her memory. As she stepped down from the auction block, her ankle turned on a loose board. She stumbled, and in one swift motion, Ethan caught her. His strong arms lifted her completely off the ground, cradling her against his chest. The crowd erupted in laughter, someone shouting, "She'll break your back, Keller." But Ethan looked down at her with a smile that transformed his handsome face. "You're just right for my arms, Miss Warren," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Then, more quietly, meant only for her, "I'm sorry for this indignity. You have my word. No harm will come to you under my protection." As he set her down gently, Julia felt something shift inside her, a tiny spark of hope igniting in a heart that had grown cold with fear and disappointment. "My wagon's this way," he said, gesturing toward a well-kept buckboard at the edge of the square. "Unless you'd prefer to stay in town tonight, there's a respectable boarding house where you could—" "No," Julia interrupted, straightening her shoulders. "I've had quite enough of Pine Creek, Mr. Keller." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. He offered his arm, and she took it, ignoring the stares that followed them across the square. As he helped her into the wagon, Julia couldn't help but wonder about this young cowboy who'd paid $25 for a woman too tall for conventional tastes. Was he truly as kind as he seemed, or would his true nature reveal itself once they were alone? The wagon lurched forward, carrying her toward an uncertain future and away from the most humiliating experience of her 22 years. "I'm not what you think, Mr. Keller," she said after they'd cleared the town limits. "I'm a teacher, not some." "I know what you are, Miss Warren," he interrupted gently. "Mrs. Henderson at the general store told me about you. How your intended took one look at you and decided to break the contract." Julia stiffened. "And yet you still bid on me." Ethan's hands were steady on the reins as he guided the horses around a bend in the road. "I didn't bid on you, Miss Warren. I bought your contract to set you free." Her head snapped toward him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that once we reach my ranch, you're free to stay or go as you please. I'll help you get to wherever you want to go, back east, or perhaps to Helena or Denver. Someplace with schools that need teachers." Julia studied his profile, looking for deception. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "Because no person should be sold like cattle, especially not for something they can't help, like being tall. He glanced at her. My sister was tall like you. She left Montana 5 years ago after hearing one too many comments about finding a man who could handle her. The mention of his sister raised as many questions as it answered. Where was she now? Why did he speak of her in the past tense? But before Julia could ask, Ethan pointed toward the horizon. Storm's coming. We should make it to the ranch before it hits, but it'll be close. The dark clouds gathering to the west made Julia shiver despite the warm summer air. Will your family be expecting us? She asked, realizing she knew nothing about his household. Something flickered across Ethan's face. A shadow of emotion quickly masked. It's just me at the ranch now, he said. My parents passed 3 winters ago. Influenza. I'm sorry, Julia said softly. There's a cabin behind the main house, he continued, changing the subject. It's small but clean. That's where you'll stay tonight. Tomorrow, we can discuss your plans. Julia nodded, feeling both relief and a strange disappointment. Relief that he truly seemed honorable in his intentions. Disappointment that he was so eager to send her away. As the wagon crested a hill, the Keller ranch came into view, a substantial 2-story house with a wide porch, flanked by a large barn and several outbuildings. Fields of hay stretched behind it, and beyond those, cattle grazed on open grassland that extended to distant mountains. It's beautiful, Julia murmured. It's home, Ethan replied, a note of pride in his voice. Then his expression changed, growing alert. Someone's here. Julia followed his gaze to see a sleek black buggy parked near the house. Expecting visitors? She asked. Ethan's jaw tightened. No, and that's Vernon Mills' buggy. He flicked the reins, urging the horses to a faster pace. Who is Vernon Mills? Julia asked, sensing the sudden tension. The banker who's been trying to foreclose on half the ranches in the county. Ethan's voice was grim, including mine. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken questions as they approached the house. What did the banker want? Why was Ethan in danger of losing his ranch? And how could he afford to help Julia if his own situation was so precarious? As the wagon rolled into the yard, a well-dressed man emerged from the house. His expensive suit and gold watch chain marked him as clearly as a brand. Vernon Mills had come to collect. The first drops of rain began to fall as Ethan helped Julia down from the wagon. The banker's eyebrows rose at the sight of her, his gaze traveling from her face to her shoes with undisguised curiosity. Mr. Keller, he called, his voice oily and confident. I see you've been to town today. How fortuitous. I've brought the final papers for your signature. Ethan positioned himself slightly in front of Julia, as if to shield her. This isn't a good time, Mills. I have a guest. The banker smiled, revealing teeth too perfect to be natural. Oh, I won't take but a moment of your time. His eyes slid to Julia again. Though I must say, I'm surprised. The talk in town was that you were too busy saving your failing ranch to take a wife. Before Ethan could respond, the skies opened, and rain began to fall in earnest. Inside, Ethan said tersely, guiding Julia toward the porch with a light touch on her elbow. As they stepped into the house, Ethan, Julia, and the unwelcome banker, the storm broke with a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations. Whatever game Vernon Mills was playing, it was clear that Ethan Keller was fighting for his survival. And Julia, still reeling from her own ordeal, now found herself caught in the middle of a battle she didn't understand. The interior of the Keller home surprised Julia. Despite Ethan's obvious financial troubles, the house was well maintained, with solid furniture and touches of refinement that suggested a woman's influence, perhaps his late mother's. A braided rug covered the polished wooden floor of the parlor, and curtains of blue-checked gingham framed the windows. Miss Warren, please make yourself comfortable, Ethan said, gesturing toward a horsehair sofa. Mr. Mills and I have business to discuss in my office. Vernon Mills removed his bowler hat, revealing thinning hair carefully arranged to hide his encroaching baldness. Actually, I believe the young lady might want to hear this. After all, if she's considering tying her future to yours, she should know what she's getting into. Ethan's face hardened. Miss Warren is a guest, not my fiancée, and my business remains private. Julia sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her back straight as a rail. Perhaps I should wait in the kitchen? No need for that, Mills said smoothly, settling into an armchair without invitation. I'll be brief. The fact is, Mr. Keller, your note is due in full by the end of the month. That's just 3 weeks away. Unless you can produce $5,000, the bank will have no choice but to foreclose. Julia couldn't help the small gasp that escaped her lips. $5,000 was an enormous sum, a schoolteacher's salary for several years. Ethan remained standing, his posture rigid. I told you I'd have the money. The cattle drive to Billings leaves tomorrow. When I return, I'll have your payment. Mills made a show of examining his fingernails. Yes, well, that's what concerns me. You're driving just 70 head to market. Even at top dollar, that won't cover your debt. I have other arrangements, Ethan said, his voice clipped. The banker smiled thinly. Of course, the mysterious windfall you've been promising for months. He stood, retrieving his hat. I came today as a courtesy, Mr. Keller. If you cannot make good on your debt, I'm prepared to offer you an alternative. I'm not interested in your alternatives. Perhaps not, but my offer stands. Sell me the water rights to Silver Creek, and I'll forgive the debt entirely. Julia watched as Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides. The water rights stay with the ranch, he said firmly, as they have since my grandfather's day. Mills sighed dramatically. Such stubbornness. Very well. I'll expect full payment when you return from Billings. If not, he let the threat hang unfinished in the air as he moved toward the door. Ethan followed, clearly eager to see the banker gone. At the threshold, Mills paused, turning back to look at Julia. Miss Warren, is it? A pleasure to make your acquaintance. Should you find yourself in need of more reliable accommodations, the Pine Creek Hotel maintains several respectable rooms for ladies. Thank you, Mr. Mills, but I'm quite comfortable here, Julia replied, surprising herself with her firm tone. After the banker left, silence filled the house, broken only by the sound of rain against the windows. Ethan stood at the door, watching until Mills' buggy disappeared down the long drive. When he turned back to Julia, his face was a mask of controlled emotion. I apologize that you had to witness that. Julia rose from the sofa. It seems I'm not the only one facing difficulties, Mr. Keller. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Ethan, please. Ethan, she amended. You spoke of a cabin for me, but in this weather, you'll stay in the house tonight, he said quickly. My mother's room is made up. The cabin would be too damp with this rain. Julia nodded, relieved. Thank you. And tomorrow? Ethan ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking every bit his youth. No more than 25, she guessed. That's the problem. I'm meant to leave at dawn with the herd. I'll be gone at least 2 weeks. I see. Julia's mind raced. 2 weeks alone in a strange place was not what she had anticipated. I would delay, Ethan continued. But as you heard, time is not my friend at the moment. Julia straightened her shoulders. Mr. Keller. Ethan, you've shown me great kindness today. Allow me to repay it by assuring you that I can manage on my own for 2 weeks. I grew up on a farm in Massachusetts. I'm not unfamiliar with rural life. Surprise registered on his face, followed by skepticism. This isn't Massachusetts, and running a ranch is different from farming. I don't presume to run your ranch, she clarified. But I can look after the house, tend the garden I saw out back, and keep an eye on things here while you're gone. Ethan studied her, seeming to weigh his options. It would be a great help, he admitted finally. My foreman's wife usually watches the place during drives, but she's visiting her sister in Helena. Then it's settled. Julia smiled, feeling useful for the first time since leaving Boston. As Ethan showed her to his mother's room and brought in her trunk from the wagon, Julia's mind was awhirl with questions. Why was Ethan in such debt? What other arrangements did he have to raise money? And why was the banker so interested in the water rights to Silver Creek? Later, as they shared a simple supper of cold ham and bread in the kitchen, Julia gathered her courage. May I ask what happened? With the ranch, I mean. Ethan set down his coffee cup. For a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer, but then he spoke. After my parents died, I took over. I was 22, thought I knew everything. His smile was self-deprecating. The first year, we had drought. I borrowed to buy feed. The second year, cattle prices fell. I borrowed more. And Mills was your lender. Ethan nodded. My father never would have dealt with him, but I was impatient. Wanted to prove myself. He looked out the window at the rain-drenched yard. Silver Creek runs through the eastern section of our land. It never runs dry, even in the worst droughts. Mills has been buying up water rights all over the county. Why? Julia asked, genuinely curious. The railroad's coming. Not to Pine Creek. They're laying track 20 miles north. Mills knows that whoever controls the water will control everything when the boom starts. Julia nodded slowly, beginning to understand. So your cattle drive is my last chance to save the ranch. Ethan met her gaze directly. I have a buyer in Billings offering top dollar, and there's another matter I need to settle there. Between the two, I should have enough to pay Mills and have a little left over to get through winter. The matter-of-fact way he described his predicament touched Julia deeply. Here was a young man facing the loss of his family legacy, yet he had still stopped to help a stranger in distress. I'll pray for your success, she said quietly. He thanked her with a nod, then changed the subject. The pantry is well stocked, and there's a milk cow in the small pasture behind the barn. Mrs. Turner, the foreman's wife, left jars of preserves in the cellar. You're welcome to anything you need. They discussed practical matters until the rain slowed and night fell completely. Ethan would leave before dawn with his small crew and the cattle. Julia would have the house, and apparently most of the ranch, to herself until his return. As she prepared for bed in the room that had once belonged to Ethan's mother, Julia found herself drawn to the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and filled with stars. In the distance, she could see the silhouette of mountains against the night sky. Montana was nothing like she had imagined. Harsher, wilder, but also more beautiful. And Ethan Keller was nothing like the husband she had traveled west to meet. The cruel man who had rejected her for her height now seemed like a blessing in disguise, for it had led her here, to this place, to this moment. But what would happen after Ethan returned? Would she still want to leave? And if she stayed, what place could there possibly be for her in his life? With these questions swirling in her mind, Julia climbed into the unfamiliar bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Dawn was just a promise on the horizon when Julia woke to the sounds of activity in the yard. She dressed quickly in a simple blue cotton day dress and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Ethan pouring coffee into a tin travel mug. "Good morning," she said, startling him. He turned, surprise evident on his face. "You're up early. I tried not to wake you. I wanted to wish you safe travels." Julia moved to the stove, where a pot of oatmeal simmered. "Have you eaten?" "No time," Ethan replied, but his eyes lingered on the pot. "Nonsense. A few minutes won't matter." She found a bowl in the cupboard and filled it, setting it on the table with a spoon. A man needs sustenance for the trail. Ethan hesitated, then sat down. "Thank you." As he ate, Julia poured herself coffee and sat opposite him. In the soft light of early morning, with his hair tousled and his face relaxed, he looked younger, more like the boy he must have been before responsibility settled on his shoulders. "I've written down everything you might need to know," he said between bites. "It's on my desk. The nearest neighbors are the Thompsons, about 3 miles west. If there's trouble, fire 3 shots in the air, and they'll hear it." Julia nodded, trying not to show her nervousness at being left alone in such a remote location. "I'll be fine. There's a loaded rifle in my parents' room. Your room now. Do you know how to use one?" "My father taught me," she said, "though I haven't fired one in years." Ethan nodded, satisfied. "Good." He finished his oatmeal and stood, reaching for his hat. "I should go? The men are waiting." Julia followed him to the door. Outside, 3 cowboys sat mounted on horses, while a young boy held the reins of a 4th, Ethan's, presumably. The cattle were gathered in a loose herd near the corral, ready to move out. "Miss Warren will be looking after the place while we're gone," Ethan announced to his men. "Tom, Jack, Dave, this is Miss Julia Warren." The cowboys tipped their hats respectfully, though Julia could see curiosity in their eyes. She nodded in return, suddenly conscious of her height, as she stood eye to eye with Ethan on the porch. "Safe journey," she said, trying to sound confident. Ethan studied her face for a moment, then reached into his pocket. "I almost forgot. The house key." He pressed a heavy iron key into her palm, his fingers warm against her skin. "Take care of yourself, Miss Warren. And you, Mr. Keller." With a final nod, he descended the steps and mounted his horse. The small procession moved off, the cattle flowing like a slow river down the drive and toward the open range beyond. Julia stood on the porch until they disappeared from sight, the rising sun casting long shadows across the land that Ethan Keller was fighting so hard to keep. The first few days passed in a rhythm of discovery and routine. Julia explored the house, finding evidence of the family that had lived there. Photographs of Ethan as a boy with his parents and a sister who indeed resembled Julia in height. Books that revealed diverse interests. A piano in the parlor that had gone unnoticed on her arrival. She kept busy tending the vegetable garden, milking the cow, gathering eggs from the small chicken coop, and preparing meals for herself from the well-stocked pantry. Each day, she watched the road, half expecting Vernon Mills to return with some new demand or threat. On the fourth day, while cleaning Ethan's office, she found a stack of letters tied with string. They were addressed to Ethan from someone named Emma Keller, postmarked from Chicago. His sister, Julia presumed. The most recent was dated only 2 months prior, contradicting Ethan's implication that his sister was somehow gone. Julia didn't read the letters. That would be an unforgivable invasion of privacy, but their existence raised questions. Why had Ethan spoken of his sister in such ambiguous terms? And why had he concealed that they remained in contact? That same afternoon, a wagon arrived carrying an older woman with iron-gray hair and a weathered face. She introduced herself as Martha Thompson from the neighboring ranch. "Thought I'd check on you," she said bluntly, climbing down from her wagon. "Word gets around. You're the mail-order bride who got auctioned off, ain't you?" Julia stiffened. "I was a teacher in Boston before coming west. The circumstances of my arrival in Pine Creek were unfortunate." Martha's shrewd eyes assessed her. "Humph. Well, you're a tall one, that's for certain. But Ethan Keller's a tall man himself. Makes sense he wouldn't mind. Mr. Keller and I have no understanding," Julia clarified, leading the woman into the kitchen. "He helped me out of a difficult situation, nothing more." Martha accepted a cup of coffee, her expression skeptical. "That boy's been running himself ragged, trying to save this place since his folks died. Never seen him take an interest in anything but cattle and crops. Then suddenly he brings home a woman? People are talking." "People are mistaken," Julia said firmly, though something fluttered in her chest at the thought that Ethan might have acted out of more than simple kindness. Martha changed the subject, asking about Julia's background and sharing local gossip. She spoke of Ethan with obvious affection, describing how he had helped her husband repair their barn roof the previous autumn despite his own pressing work. "That's the kind of neighbor he is," Martha said. "Gives more than he takes. Unlike some I could mention." "Vernon Mills?" Julia guessed. Martha's face darkened. "That snake. Been trying to get his hands on Silver Creek for years. Ethan's father would never sell, and neither will Ethan. Even to save the ranch. Especially to save the ranch. Without that water, this land wouldn't be worth half what it is." Martha leaned forward. "You know about the railroad coming?" Julia nodded. "Ethan mentioned it. Mills wants to dam the creek, sell water rights to the railroad, and to whatever town springs up around the station. He's already bought up 3 smaller streams that feed into it." As Martha continued, Julia began to understand the full scope of Ethan's predicament. It wasn't just about saving his family's legacy. It was about preserving a way of life for the entire valley. Before leaving, Martha invited Julia to Sunday dinner at the Thompson Ranch. "No reason for you to sit alone out here. My Henry makes the trip to town for church each week. He can pick you up on the way." Julia accepted gratefully, touched by the older woman's kindness. That night, unable to sleep, Julia wandered into Ethan's office again. The stack of letters from Emma Keller called to her, promising answers to questions she had no right to ask. Instead, she opened the ranch ledger that lay on the desk. The columns of figures told a grim story: dwindling reserves, mounting debts. A notation on the final page caught her eye. Chicago payment due August 15th. That was less than 2 weeks away, and the amount, $1,200, was substantial. Was this the other arrangement Ethan had mentioned to Mills? But what business did he have in Chicago that required such a large payment? Julia closed the ledger, uncomfortable with her prying. Whatever secrets Ethan Keller kept were his own. She had no claim on his confidences, just as he had no claim on hers. Still, as she returned to bed, she couldn't help but wonder about the man who had rescued her from humiliation, only to ride away leaving more questions than answers in his wake. The days settled into a pattern. Julia kept the house, tended the garden, and explored the ranch on foot. careful not to venture too far from the main buildings. Each evening, she wrote in her journal, documenting her experiences and the changing landscape as summer began its slow transition toward autumn. On Sunday, Henry Thompson collected her for church and dinner as promised. The small white clapboard church in Pine Creek was filled with curious faces, many of whom Julia recognized from the auction. The Reverend preached on the Good Samaritan, and Julia felt the weight of stares throughout the service. Dinner at the Thompson farm was a welcome respite from the scrutiny. Martha and Henry's grown children had come with their families, filling the house with laughter and conversation. For a few hours, Julia forgot her uncertain status, caught up in the simple joy of community. It was during the meal that Henry mentioned the telegram. "Came for Ethan yesterday," he said, passing Julia a plate of cornbread. "Station master asked if I'd deliver it since I was heading this way." Julia accepted the folded paper with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Did he say who sent it?" Henry shook his head. "Nope, but it came from Chicago, if that means anything." It did. The mysterious payment noted in the ledger, the letters from Emma Keller with their Chicago postmark. Julia thanked Henry, tucking the telegram into her pocket for later. That evening, alone in the quiet house, she placed the unopened telegram on Ethan's desk. The temptation to read it was strong, but she resisted. Whatever connection Ethan had to Chicago, it wasn't her business unless he chose to make it so. The second week of Ethan's absence passed more slowly than the first. Julia found herself watching the road more frequently, anticipating his return. She told herself it was natural concern for her host, nothing more, but the flutter in her stomach when she imagined seeing him again suggested otherwise. On the 12th day, Julia was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard hoofbeats. Her heart leaped, but it wasn't Ethan returning early. It was Vernon Mills, riding alone on a handsome bay gelding. "Miss Warren," he called, dismounting with the awkward movements of a man unaccustomed to horseback. "What a pleasant surprise to find you still here." Julia nodded stiffly. "Mr. Mills, Mr. Keller isn't back yet, I'm afraid." "So I gathered." Mills removed his hat, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Actually, I came to speak with you." "With me?" Julia's suspicion must have shown on her face. Mills smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "May I trouble you for a glass of water? It's a warm day for riding." Reluctantly, Julia led him to the kitchen, where she pumped water into a glass. Mills accepted it gratefully, settling uninvited at the table. "Miss Warren, forgive my bluntness, but I feel it my duty to inform you of certain facts regarding your host." Julia remained standing, arms folded. "What facts would those be, Mr. Mills?" "Ethan Keller is on the verge of financial ruin. This ranch will be foreclosed upon by month's end unless a miracle occurs." Mills set down his glass. "I don't know what arrangement exists between you two, but if you're harboring hopes of security here, I must advise you to reconsider." "My arrangements with Mr. Keller are private," Julia replied coolly, "and I fail to see how they concern you." Mills leaned forward. "Perhaps this will concern you. Ethan Keller has been sending substantial sums to Chicago for the past 3 years. Did you know that?" Julia's face betrayed nothing, though her mind raced. "As I said, Mr. Keller's business is his own, even when that business might involve another woman." Mills raised an eyebrow. "A woman he supports financially while allowing you to believe he's unattached?" The suggestion struck Julia like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure. "Mr. Mills, I believe it's time for you to leave." The banker rose slowly, retrieving his hat. "I came out of concern, Miss Warren. This is a harsh country for a woman alone. Should you find yourself in need of assistance after Keller's inevitable downfall, my door is always open." "I'll keep that in mind," Julia said tightly, walking him to the door. As Mills mounted his horse, he offered one parting shot. "Ask him about Emma when he returns. See if he tells you the truth." Julia stood on the porch until Mills disappeared down the drive, her thoughts in turmoil. The banker's insinuations had found fertile ground in her own uncertainties. Was Emma Keller truly Ethan's sister? Or was she something else? A wife, perhaps, or a lover? That night, Julia slept poorly, her dreams filled with faceless women in Chicago and auction blocks where she stood alone while Ethan rode away without a backward glance. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with a hint of autumn in the air. Julia was in the garden, harvesting late summer vegetables, when she heard the now familiar sound of approaching horses. This time, when she looked up, her heart gave a joyful leap. Ethan rode at the head of his small group, his hat pulled low against the sun. He looked tired but sat straight in the saddle, every inch the capable rancher returning from a successful drive. Julia straightened, suddenly conscious of her appearance. Hair escaping its pins, hands dirty from the garden, her plain work dress spotted with soil. She smoothed her skirt as best she could and moved toward the house. Ethan spotted her and raised a hand in greeting. The simple gesture shouldn't have affected her so strongly, but Julia felt warmth spread through her chest. He was back, safe and whole, and whatever questions hung between them could wait at least until he had rested. The cowboys dispersed toward the bunkhouse as Ethan dismounted in the yard. The young boy who had held his horse 2 weeks earlier took the reins again, leading the animal toward the barn. "Miss Warren," Ethan called, crossing the yard with long strides. "Everything all right here?" Julia nodded, surprised at how genuinely pleased he looked to see her. "Everything's fine. Welcome home, Mr. Keller." He stopped a few feet away, seeming to remember himself. "Ethan," he corrected gently. "After 2 weeks of Mr. Keller from my men, I'd welcome the sound of my given name." "Ethan," she amended, smiling. "How was your journey? Successful, I hope." A shadow crossed his face, quickly replaced by a determined expression. "Successful enough. The cattle fetched a good price, better than I'd hoped, and I was able to resolve some other matters while in Billings." Julia wanted to ask about those other matters, but held her tongue. "You must be exhausted. I've kept supper warm. It's nothing fancy, just a stew and some fresh bread." Gratitude flooded his face. "That sounds better than anything I've eaten in weeks." He gestured toward the house. "After you." As they walked together, Julia became acutely aware of their height difference, or rather, the lack of it. Standing next to Ethan, she felt properly proportioned for the first time since arriving in Montana. At nearly 6 feet tall himself, he made her feel neither too big nor too small, but simply right. In the kitchen, Julia served the stew while Ethan washed up at the pump outside. When he returned, hair damp and face clean-shaven, she was struck again by his youthfulness. Despite the responsibilities he carried, he couldn't be more than 25 or 26. They ate together as Ethan recounted tales from the cattle drive, the stampede narrowly averted during a thunderstorm, the river crossing that soaked every man to the skin, the campfire stories shared under star-filled skies. Julia, in turn, told him of her days at the ranch, the garden's bounty, Martha Thompson's visit, the Sunday dinner with the neighbors. She didn't mention Mill's visit or the telegram from Chicago. After the meal, they moved to the porch with cups of coffee. The evening air was cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I've been thinking about your situation," Ethan said finally, breaking a comfortable silence. "With the money from the cattle, I can offer you passage to Helena or even Denver. Both cities have schools that might hire an experienced teacher." Julia's heart sank at his eagerness to send her away, though she tried not to show it. "That's very generous. It's the least I can do after everything you've been through." Ethan stared into his coffee cup. "You've kept my home better than I deserve these past weeks." Julia gathered her courage. "And if I chose to stay?" His head came up sharply, surprise evident in his eyes. "Stay? Here in Pine Creek?" "Or here at the ranch," she said quietly. "If there was a position for a teacher locally, or if you needed help with the household." Ethan set his cup down carefully. "Julia, the ranch isn't secure. You heard Mills. If I can't make the payment by the end of the month, I'll lose everything." "And can you make the payment?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Between the cattle and other resources, I'll have enough. But it will leave nothing for extras. No hired help, no luxuries." "I don't require luxury," Julia said. "And I'm not asking to be kept. I would earn my way somehow." Ethan's expression softened. "You've already suffered one man's rejection because of your height. I wouldn't want you to limit your prospects by staying in a place where others might judge you similarly." The mention of her height surprised her. "Is that what you think? That I'm staying because I believe no one else would want me?" "No," he said quickly. "That's not what I meant. Because I'll have you know, Mr. Keller, that I am perfectly content with my stature. It allows me to reach high shelves without assistance and to look men directly in the eye when they speak nonsense." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I've noticed." The truth is, Julia continued, her voice softening, I've come to care for this place in the short time I've been here. And for the people. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, of feelings neither was ready to name. Ethan broke the gaze first. There is something you should know before you decide anything. He took a deep breath. It's about the payments to Chicago that Mills no doubt mentioned. Julia stilled. He did call yesterday. Anger flashed across Ethan's face. Of course he did. He stood, pacing the length of the porch. My sister, Emma, lives in Chicago. She's receiving treatment at a sanitarium there for consumption. Tuberculosis. Julia's hand went to her throat. Ethan nodded grimly. She contracted it 5 years ago. At first, we thought the mountain air might help, but she grew worse. The doctors in Chicago offer specialized treatments unavailable here. The payments are for her care. I'm so sorry, Julia said, understanding now the burden Ethan carried. Is she improving? Slowly. The most recent letter suggested she might be well enough to travel by spring. He stopped pacing, leaning against the porch rail. The treatment is expensive. It's why I've been so desperate to keep the ranch profitable. Without it, I couldn't afford her care. Julia rose, moving to stand beside him. Thank you for telling me. Mills tried to imply. I can imagine what Mills implied. Ethan interrupted, his voice hard. He's been trying to drive a wedge between me and anyone who might help me keep this land. Why is the water so important to him? Power, Ethan said simply. Control. The railroad will need water for its steam engines. Any settlement that grows around the station will need water for homes and businesses. Whoever controls Silver Creek will essentially control the future of this valley. Julia nodded, understanding at last the true stakes of Ethan's struggle. Your father must have been a wise man to recognize that. He was. Ethan's expression softened at the mention of his father. He taught me that land isn't just something you own. It's something you protect for those who come after you. They stood in companionable silence, watching as the last light faded from the western sky. Julia felt a sense of peace settle over her, despite the uncertainties that still lay ahead. It's getting late, Ethan said finally. You must be tired. Julia nodded, though she was reluctant for the evening to end. Will you be leaving again soon? For Chicago, perhaps? No need, he said. I've made arrangements to wire the payment for Emma's next quarter of treatment. The money from the cattle drive will cover both that and Mill's note, with a little left over. Relief washed over Julia. I'm glad. As they moved inside, Ethan paused in the doorway. About your staying on, let me think on it a bit more. There might be a position at the school in Pine Creek. The current teacher mentioned retiring after this term. Julia smiled, hope blooming in her chest. I'd like that. Good night, Julia, he said softly, using her given name for the first time. Good night, Ethan, she replied, savoring the newfound intimacy between them as she climbed the stairs to her room. The next morning, Julia woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly in a forest green day dress with a modest bustle and made her way downstairs to find Ethan in the kitchen, attempting to cook breakfast. Good morning, she said, trying not to laugh at his obvious struggle with the stove. He turned, relief washing over his face. Thank heaven. I was about to burn down the house. Julia moved beside him, taking the spatula from his hand. Allow me. Their fingers brushed, sending a shock of awareness through her. Ethan seemed to feel it too, for he stepped back quickly, busying himself with pouring coffee. I thought I'd ride into town today, he said as they sat down to eat. Need to deposit the cattle money and check on a few things. Would you like to come along? Julia hesitated, remembering the stares and whispers she'd endured in church. I'm not sure I'm ready to face Pine Creek again so soon. Understanding dawned in Ethan's eyes. Of course, I wasn't thinking. He cut into his eggs. Actually, there's something I'd like to show you later, if you're willing. It's a short ride from here. Curiosity piqued. Julia nodded. I'd like that. After breakfast, Ethan rode to town while Julia tackled the accumulated laundry from his journey. By mid-afternoon, when he returned, she had transformed the house. Clothes washed and pressed, floors swept, a fresh-baked pie cooling on the windowsill. It smells like home in here, Ethan said as he entered, his voice soft with wonder. I'd forgotten what that was like. Julia felt a flush of pleasure at his words. Apple pie. I found some late apples in the orchard behind the house. He set a parcel on the table. I brought something for you. A thank you for looking after things while I was gone. Julia unwrapped the brown paper to find a book of poetry, Tennyson's collected works. How did you know I like poetry? I noticed you reading the volume in my father's study, Ethan admitted. This edition is newer. The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. Thank you. Ethan shifted, suddenly seeming nervous. Are you still up for that ride I mentioned? We should go now if we want to be back by supper. 20 minutes later, they were mounted on horseback, Julia on a gentle mare named Daisy, Ethan on his own stallion. They rode east, away from town, following a trail that wound through rolling grassland toward distant hills. Where are we going? Julia asked as they crested a rise. Silver Creek, Ethan replied, pointing ahead. I want you to see what Mills is after. They rode for another mile before Julia heard it, the unmistakable sound of running water. Rounding a stand of cottonwood trees, they came upon the creek itself, a ribbon of silver winding through the golden landscape. Ethan dismounted, helping Julia down from her horse. They stood on the bank, watching the clear water bubble over rocks and swirl in quiet pools. It's beautiful, Julia murmured. It never runs dry, Ethan said, pride evident in his voice. Even in the worst drought years, Silver Creek keeps flowing. My grandfather chose this land specifically because of it. They walked along the bank, Ethan pointing out beaver dams and the tracks of deer that came to drink. In a meadow beside the creek, wildflowers still bloomed, purple asters and yellow goldenrod, defying the approach of autumn. This is what Mills wants to dam up, Julia said, understanding now why Ethan fought so hard. He'd destroy all this. Ethan nodded grimly. And control who gets water downstream. He doesn't see the creek as living, just as a resource to exploit. They sat on a fallen log, the horses grazing nearby. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the landscape, highlighting the copper in Julia's chestnut hair and warming the tan of Ethan's face. I spoke with Reverend Peters in town today, Ethan said after a comfortable silence. The school board is indeed looking for a teacher for the spring term. Mrs. Hollister is retiring in December. Julia's heart leaped. And did he think? He said they'd be fortunate to have someone with your experience and education. Ethan smiled at her obvious delight. Of course, you'd need somewhere to live in the meantime. I could stay at the boarding house in town, Julia suggested, though the thought held little appeal. Ethan looked down at his hands. Or you could stay at the ranch. The cabin behind the house would give you privacy, but you'd be close enough not to be isolated. As your employee? Julia asked carefully. As my friend, he corrected. And perhaps, in time. He didn't finish the thought, but the way his eyes met hers, filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun, made Julia's breath catch. I'd like that, she said softly. To stay as your friend. And to see what time might bring. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Ethan stood, offering his hand to help her up. We should head back before we lose the light. As they rode home side by side, Julia felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The path ahead wasn't clear or certain, but for the first time since leaving Boston, she felt she was moving in the right direction. The following weeks brought a rhythm to life at the Keller Ranch that Julia found deeply satisfying. With Ethan's help, she moved into the small cabin behind the main house, a snug one-room structure with a stone fireplace, comfortable bed, and window overlooking the garden. Though she took her meals with Ethan in the main house, the cabin gave her independence and privacy. September faded into October, bringing cooler nights and trees aflame with autumn colors. Ethan made good on his debt to Mills, delivering the payment in person with Julia at his side, a silent statement of solidarity that caused whispers throughout Pine Creek but gave her immense satisfaction. Julia met with the school board and was formally offered the teaching position beginning in January. In the meantime, she assisted Mrs. Hollister 3 days a week, getting to know the children and the curriculum. On days she wasn't at the school, Julia helped around the ranch, keeping the books, tending the garden, preserving the last of the harvest for winter. She discovered a talent for ranch management that surprised both her and Ethan, her organized mind bringing order to his somewhat haphazard approach to record-keeping. Their friendship deepened with each passing day. They shared evening meals and conversations that stretched long into the night. Julia learned of Ethan's dreams for the ranch, the improvements he hoped to make, the legacy he wanted to build. In turn, she told him of her childhood in Massachusetts, her years teaching in Boston, and her brief, failed engagement to a banker's son who had found her intellectual interests unseemly. "He sounds like a fool," Ethan had said, stoking the fire in the parlor. "Any man would be fortunate to have a wife with a mind as sharp as yours." The word wife had hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging it directly, but both aware of its implications. As October gave way to November, Julia received a letter from Boston, her former principal inquiring whether she planned to return east. The school had held her position, hoping her western adventure would be short-lived. Julia sat on the porch of her cabin, reading the letter for the third time. The offer was generous, the position familiar and secure. Yet the thought of returning to Boston, to the narrow confines of her former life, filled her with a strange sadness. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Ethan stood there, hat in hand, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "I was hoping you might join me for a ride," he said. "There's something I'd like to show you." Julia tucked the letter into her pocket. Of course. They rode west this time, toward the mountains that had become familiar landmarks on Julia's horizon. The day was crisp and clear, the sky an impossible blue against the snow-capped peaks. After about an hour, they crested a hill to find a small valley spread before them, sheltered by ridges on three sides. A stream, not Silver Creek, but one of its tributaries, ran through the center. Near the stream stood the stone foundation of what must have once been a cabin. "What is this place?" Julia asked as they dismounted. "My grandfather's original homestead," Ethan said, leading her toward the foundation. "He built here first, before moving to the current ranch site. My father always talked about rebuilding it someday as a second home, somewhere to escape to when the main ranch got too busy." Julia walked the perimeter of the foundation, imagining the cabin that once stood there. "It's beautiful here. So peaceful." Ethan nodded, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I've been thinking of building on it myself. A small house, nothing fancy. Something that could be a home." The word home resonated in Julia's heart. "For when your sister returns from Chicago?" "No." Ethan moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Emma will stay at the main house when she's well enough to travel. This would be for a different purpose." Julia waited, hardly daring to breathe. "I received a letter yesterday," he continued, "from the railroad company. They're interested in buying water rights to part of Silver Creek. Not all of it, just enough for their needs at the news station." "Will you sell?" Julia asked, surprised by the change in subject. "I've made a counteroffer. Access to enough water for their operations, but the rights stay with the land. And in exchange," Ethan took a deep breath. "In exchange, they'll build a spur line to Pine Creek." Julia gasped. "A railroad to Pine Creek? That would change everything. For the better, I think. The town would grow. The school would need more teachers. The ranch would have easier access to markets." He took her hands in his. "Julia, I know you received a letter from Boston today. Martha Thompson mentioned your former school had written." Julia nodded, touched by his directness. "They've held my position. I could return after Christmas if I wished." "And do you wish to return?" The vulnerability in his eyes nearly undid her. "No," she said softly. "My life is here now, with the children at the school, with Martha and Henry, with—" She hesitated, then finished boldly. "With you, Ethan." Relief washed over his face, followed by a determination that made her heart race. "I'm glad," he said simply, "because I've grown rather fond of looking you in the eye when we speak." Julia laughed, the sound bright in the clear mountain air. "Is that all you've grown fond of?" "No," he admitted, stepping closer. "I've grown fond of your smile, and your mind, and the way you handle a difficult situation. I've grown fond of seeing you across the breakfast table each morning and hearing your thoughts each evening." Julia felt tears prick her eyes at his words. "I've grown fond of those things too." Ethan reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "When I first saw you on that auction block in Pine Creek, I was outraged that any man could look at you and see only your height. To me, you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, strong and dignified despite your circumstances." "You lifted me up," Julia whispered. "When everyone else thought I was too big, you said I was just right for your arms." "You are," he affirmed. "In every way that matters, you fit perfectly in my life." Julia Warren. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Ethan stepped back slightly, reaching into his pocket. "I brought you here for a reason," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I wanted you to see this place because I hope. That is, I wish." Julia waited, her heart pounding. "I'm making a mess of this," Ethan said with a self-deprecating laugh. Then he straightened, his expression growing serious. "Julia Warren, I love you. I think I've loved you since the moment I saw you standing tall despite every indignity. I want to build a life with you, here on this land, in that school, in whatever future we create together." He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl. "This was my mother's. I would be honored if you would wear it as my wife." Tears spilled freely down Julia's cheeks now. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Ethan Keller." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Julia felt as if every step of her journey, from Boston to that humiliating auction block to this moment, had been leading her home. Home to this land, to this man who saw her not as too big or too small, but as exactly right. Ethan gathered her into his arms then, lifting her off the ground in his excitement. She laughed as he spun her around, the mountains and valley blurring into a panorama of joy. When he set her down, his arms remained around her waist, her hands on his shoulders. They stood eye to eye, two tall figures against the vast Montana sky, perfectly matched in height and heart. "You're just right for my arms," Ethan whispered, echoing the words that had begun their journey together. Then he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that promised forever. And as the late autumn sun cast long shadows across what would someday be their home, Julia knew that she had found where she belonged, in this wild, beautiful country, with this good, honorable man who had seen her true worth when others had failed to look beyond appearances. They were married that December in the small church in Pine Creek, with Martha and Henry Thompson as witnesses and the entire community in attendance. Julia wore a dress of deep blue velvet that complemented her height and carried a bouquet of pine branches and dried wildflowers from Silver Creek. The following spring, as the first trains began running to Pine Creek and Emma Keller returned home from Chicago, pale but recovering, Ethan and Julia broke ground on their new home in the sheltered valley. They would divide their time between the main ranch and this private retreat, building a legacy of love on land that had sustained generations. And when their first child was born, a daughter with her mother's height and her father's hazel eyes, they named her Hope, for that was what they had given each other on a summer day when a tall, beautiful woman had been sold for being too big, and a young, handsome cowboy had picked her up and said, "You're just right for my arms."